All right, it's January 2022. I'm on one of the many investigations we're usually supporting at one time, and the consultants I'm supporting come across this IP address. Unless you're a wizard, I'm sure you don't recognize it off the top of your head. So I looked it up real quick. We weren't tracking it at the time, and so just following my usual workflows, start running this through other systems, see what we can pull on this, and I came across a little domain resolution to this domain right here. At the time, of course, I'm sure I'm asking myself the same question that I'm sure many of you would ask is, the heck is a Lapsus group? So I started Googling around, right? This is a live shot of about a year ago. So I started Googling around trying to figure out what the heck this thing is. I come across this like Slovakian IT firm or something called like Lapsus Technologies Group, and I'm like, are they compromised? Is this some weird masquerade? But like neither of those hypotheses kind of stood up, and it didn't make much sense. So I keep digging, and I come across a couple news articles like this one. Turns out the Brazilian Ministry of Health and some Portuguese media company had been compromised in the last couple months by a ransomware group called Lapsus Group. So my initial reaction, of course, is like, oh great, all right, it's another ransomware group, whatever, just another run-of-the-mill investigation. Well, I could not have been more wrong. It was, we quickly found out how much of a cluster this group really was. And over the course of several weeks and many investigations, we eventually got a pretty good hold of what this group looked like. And so like as far as their targeting goes, it was pretty random. Couple tailored victims at the time, but otherwise pretty random. Their MO and like the TTPs they use, seemingly pretty random. In some cases, they were using like stolen credentials that they clearly got from like a redline stealer or something like that. In other cases, they were using like M365 session tokens they had stolen. In some cases, they're stealing data. In some cases, they're not. It was pretty random. But then also thanks to their kind of unprecedented transparency, we don't usually see our cybercrime groups that we're tracking publicly celebrate and discuss their intrusions in a Telegram channel. We're able to track a number of personas pretty easily with relation to this group. So that was over the course of like a couple months. And then another threat actor kind of landed in our labs. This one by the name of UNC3786. UNC3786 was a little bit different than Lapsus Group. They were also kind of a little more amorphous. It was really hard to tell like which actors were really associated with this group, because in some cases we had them doing data theft and then nothing else. Other cases we had them performing data theft and then extortion, but not just the like, we're gonna publish your name on a wall of shame extortion. We're talking the kind of extortion that they're directly contacting executives, employees with like aggressive language and very specific threats. And despite it being kind of amorphous, we were at least able to kind of group a number of these investigations together as UNC3786. But as we're looking at this, it started to kind of shape up to look like some other intrusions we had seen from months past, specifically referencing a number of other groups. But the problem is we didn't really have linkage to it. So unfortunately, as we were trying to start to kind of pull the threads on this and make connections, we had to table that because a third group dropped on our lab. This actually spawned out of one of the UNC3786 investigations we did. As we were wrapping up there, some more intrusion activity started to happen, and of course we're like, is this related to the actor we were just trying to kick out? Is this new? Dunno, it's time to dive back in. UNC3944 was definitely a departure from the other two. They're a little less like bull in a china shop type activity, but they had a very specific mission. They conducted a lot of SMS phishing using domains that were like masquerading as single sign-on, and all the domains were very tailored to the victims. They also conducted like pretty shameless harassment of employees. They would be texting employees. They'd also just do things like change usernames in an environment to totally just like make fun of or call people out or create domains that were calling out specific employees. And then they even eventually went to the point where they were targeting security companies. And ultimately, it was to conduct SIM swapping. So we have all this destructive activity to conduct some SIM swapping, which they're effectively just selling. And then over the course of time, it turned out they were at multiple victims, going through multiple angles just to sell some SIM swapping activity. So we have 3 groups now. We got Lapsus, we had 3944, we had 3786. As all these names start popping up, people start referring to this activity as Lapsus-like or Lapsus adjacent. And this name really started to piss me off. Because in my head, I'm kind of like that well actually guy, and I'm like, well, Lapsus is different, Lapsus is not doing SIM swapping and all this stuff. But clearly, Lapsus had left their mark on the industry at the time. Of course, I didn't want this label to start being inclusive of all this other activity that's definitely not Lapsus. But at the same time, I couldn't really blame people. Because at the surface level, of course, like we kind of had a little deeper look, but at the surface level, you have groups like shamelessly just dropping their own VMs onto networks and using commercial VPNs. We have groups targeting individuals, and just outright brazen with all of their activity, and just then also using Telegram to publicly celebrate their successes with zero shame all across the board. Just like Lapsus. And just when I thought I hated this term, another one appeared by the name of Octopus. Group IB coined this term when they dropped a blog talking about a pretty widespread phishing campaign with a bunch of domains masquerading as single sign-on services like Okta. Okta also published about this and called this activity scatter swine. No offense to Okta, but fortunately that name didn't take off, and that's one less name to just worry about, because oh my god, I was starting to get real pissed off. But we also saw some of the domains reported in this Octopus activity used by UNC3944. So UNC3944 must be Octopus, right? Or at least overlapped with it? No, it's not. Well, sort of anyway. We were actually tracking most of these Octopus domains as 2 separate clusters before Group IB's report even came out, UNC4115, UNC4118. But then again, before all of that, we saw, and you can see just by the number, we were tracking UNC3944 using some of these domains before we were even aware of this more widespread phishing campaign. So I hope you're taking notes, because we're at, 5-6 UNCs now, and it's getting really confusing. And just to throw one more on top of that, CrowdStrike drops a blog out there. It was a really good write-up. I recommend you read it. And this was at least more overlapped with UNC3944 as far as like one-to-one. And I'm in full support of vendor naming schemes, but so of course CrowdStrike went with scattered spider to fit with their like taxonomy there. But now we're starting to have a public narrative challenge on our hands. We've got Lapsus, we've got UNC3661, we've got UNC3786, we've got 3944, we've got Octopus, we've got Scatterswine, we've got Scattered Spider. If you're confused, good, because I am too, and that's kind of the point here. And just when you thought we were done, don't worry, Lapsus came back. At least it was said they did. September rolls around, and an incident kind of dropped into all of our laps out of nowhere from a certain rideshare company. And it was from a person who was calling themselves Teapots. But then rumblings started to happen that, hey, actually, we think this is Lapsus. And I'm like, no, Lapsus is dead. Like, they were all arrested. They were disbanded a few months ago. There were revival attempts, but those never really took off. And I think I was really in just denial about it. I didn't want this nightmare group coming back into my life. But ultimately, it turned out that this Teapots individual was indeed this individual known as Sigma back in the first Lapsus campaign. Even though he was arrested, he came back and started doing some more things on his own, just under this new moniker. So now we have a new problem on our hands. What is UNC39, or sorry, see, I'm even getting confused. And I wrote this. So what is UNC3661? So like we can usually tell like groups of like ransomware operators or RAS schemes or groups of operators from fin groups or whatever, we can usually track them pretty consistently. and cluster them confidently with their original activity. But in this case, thanks to the group's unprecedented transparency, so now we have a known Lapsus operator, not just an operator, but the face of the operation, who came back, started doing basically the same thing as Lapsus was doing before, but not as Lapsus. So what defines Lapsus? What defines this cluster? Is it the group? Is it this individual? We have to at least ask these questions and try to figure out, like, okay, how do we cluster this? Do we call this another UNC? Do we put another UNC in the mix? Do we call it 3661, even though it might not really be? And especially in this case, we didn't really have technical links. At Mandiant, we're very driven with technical evidence and data to really back up our attribution, but we kind of didn't have those technical links here. It was more a little more unreliable information, but we were confident about it. It was beyond a shadow of a doubt, this X or not X Lapsus guy. So after some debate between various team members on Intel, I'm kind of revealing what's the phrase I want to use? Taking you with a peek behind the curtain right now to kind of see a little aspect of Mandiant that we don't really talk about, and that's the use of subgroups. Don't tell any of the Mandiant folks in the room I'm telling you this. So subgroups are basically subsets of activity that are part of a larger threat that we can distinctly cluster as like a subgroup. It's usually applied to bigger groups like APTs, and when you have a ton of data you can work with, you can confidently section that out. But in this case, we have a smaller group, but it seemed like a decent way to kind of cluster this. We usually use human names to kind of separate these groups and just tag them onto the end, like Felix or Kate. Don't worry about what groups those are part of. But in this case, as the wise warrior poet Olivia Rodrigo said, it's brutal out here with all these unks, so we went with Olivia. And part of this Olivia activity actually surfaced an artifact that now pointed to bring this all back together, that this individual, or the individual conducting the operation, was in a private Telegram channel with operators from UNC3944, which we were pretty sure was completely unrelated. At this point, I'm like, I don't even know what to believe. I thought these were all separate. I was wrong, maybe. I don't know. But just to show, there we go. This is not like a complete picture, but the point being, we have all these certain nodes and relationships and groups and operators and personas, and then on top of that, we have all these names. We have 3944, we have Lapsus, 3661, we have Olivia. We've got, I'm losing track. 4115, 4118, Octopus, Scattered Spider, Scatter Swine. It's an absolute disaster. So it becomes really hard to tell, like, what exactly defines a group, especially when we have other clusters where it's like, hey, this feels like this other group, but we really don't have data to back it up, but we're pretty sure it's this group. It just becomes a mess. So ultimately, Octopus has taught me that we have two major problems on our hands. We have a communication problem that has to do with the meaning of a group of activity as far as like public communications go. And then now we have a new tracking problem. So we're using a graph at Mandiant to really track these groups. It works really well for clusters that we can definitively link based on technical evidence or divide based on technical evidence. But when these lines start to get blurred, as you saw 2 slides ago, or last slide rather, it gets really messy. And it becomes hard to understand, like, oh, what is this group again? And names start being thrown around and it's a disaster. For the communication piece, this isn't about necessarily vendors using different names. I'm on full support of that. It's pretty easy to go like, hey, we call this X, but so-and-so calls it Y. That's not really that much of a problem. But it comes down to trying to balance like, hey, the methodology of the way we cluster things, and then the level of visibility we have into the data that goes into clustering this group. Like before, rather than relying solely on technical evidence, now we have to be concerned about like Telegram and all these personas that are less reliable. But we need to have insight into those things, and it becomes difficult to cluster if you don't. But at the same time, we also want to be accurate with our reporting, accurate with our feedback, but also trying to balance that with digestibility. If you've a client asking us like, hey, what can you tell us about octopus? Or an article comes out like, oh, this is octopus. Like to us, does that mean 3944? Does that mean 4118? Does that mean 4115? Is that other data that we actually aren't even tracking yet? I don't know. It becomes really hard to start to communicate that. And on the tracking piece, like I said earlier, it is easy to use the system we have to do technical linkage with things like fin groups or ransomware affiliates or ransomware service operations where they're a little more fixed. Of course, you might have operators leave or come back or whatever, but generally it's a little more fixed and we have a lot of technical data to cluster those. Meanwhile, you have groups like UNC3786 where the data we have to use to cluster is way less reliable than technical connections. So we've had a number of conversations internally, and it starts to raise the question, and this isn't necessarily like Mandiant gospel, but if there's anything Octopus has taught me, it's like, I think we have to reevaluate maybe how we cluster cybercrime. Is there a line where we stop calling it a group? Because it's easy to think like, oh, a group is a group of people, but like it's not. So I don't necessarily have the answer. All I came to you today with was complaints and no solutions, which I'm sure everyone loves. But we're in an ever-evolving industry, an ever-turbulent industry, and as this new like genre of threat actor starts to appear more and more in our lives, this is going to be a real question because we can't keep going to clients and be like, hey, yeah, it's these 4 groups that might be related, might be not, but then you can't come to them with like 16 different names. It just doesn't work. So ultimately, Octopus has taught us that clustering might need to be reevaluated for cybercrime, but then also how to turn that new clustering technique into communication. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Hey, Jake, sorry. When the group was so insistent on calling themselves Lapsus, why did you never just go with that?
It's not necessarily we like didn't go with it, but at least as far as our tracking mechanisms, we're pretty structured on using like those UNC numbers. So even if it has like a public name like that, we still have to cluster it as something as far as our internal systems go. We don't really just use like, oh, this is whatever they call themselves, and this is UNC3944, and this is whatever group. Like every name has, every group rather has to have at least some sort of like UNC or APT number, and then we just can usually mark that with like, hey, they call themselves this. So we don't necessarily not use Lapsus, but it's like, hey, we track Lapsus as this. So yeah, we're not going to deny them, I guess, their own identity if they come up with it. But and it's definitely easy to communicate them as Lapsus, but as far as our tracking goes, it's 3661. So it's both. Hopefully that answers the question.
Hi.
Yes.
I was curious if, like, thinking through this, and admittedly, the team I work on has been like tackling this same problem. Nice. With this group or this cluster F of activity already. And I'm curious, like, I understand Mandiant has been in this game for a long time, thinking through like, how do you cluster? How do you talk about groups in ways that define their relationships, help customers understand what those relationships really mean for protecting themselves? Like, what is happening at Mandiant now, like, as a result of this, cluster of activity to better like improve the way that you do that in the future?
Yeah. So the last slide is kind of what I was getting to there. There is not necessarily any like official movement. As far as I'm aware of, but that kind of like sliding scale of like fixed versus fluid groups. If you saw the subheading on the slide, like I've had conversations with a teammate, Jeremy Kennelly, on the FinCrime team. We definitely know this is something we need to tackle. It just has not been the top of the list right now. But yeah, some of the things we might look at is like, hey, do we need to introduce new ways to show relationships between these groups and call it something else bigger? Or do we need to just define the way we cluster Or like, do we keep the same mechanism but define a different way we do it? I don't know what the answer will be, but it's definitely something that's on our plates.
Hi, Jake.
Hi, Kirsty.
So my question for you is, if you had any words of wisdom for the analysts in the room of how to kind of talk to their customers or the people that are affected by these types of groups in the detangling of who's doing the what?
Oh, that's a great question. And this is back to the communication problem. It's like, do you throw a huge diagram like you saw on the absolute trash pile of a slide that was this web of connected dots and things, or do you just kind of suck it up and go like, it's octopus, even though like as far as where like, is it though? What is octopus? I don't know. So definitely in some cases, I don't know what the right answer is. I don't really. My client is consulting, so I don't necessarily deal with Intel customers. So I don't know what the right call is, but I feel like at the end of the day, as simple as possible is the best way to do it. Because we have 14 different unks that represent this larger activity, but like they don't care. At the end of the day, just make it as simple as possible. I think that's at least my personal stance on it.